All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully this will be interesting enough and nobody will fall asleep on us. We know it's the last class, but we'll keep it a little bit fun for you. So we're going to play a game. We're doing something a little bit different here. Jonathan is going to start us off, so I'll let him introduce himself in a second, and then he'll get us started. But what you're going to do is Jonathan is going to take you through the steps of extraction, specifically to his facility. He'll mention the other extraction methods as well, but he's going to take you through that. And while he is talking about that, you guys are going to try to guess all of the waste streams. This isn't like class participation. You don't have to shout anything out or write it down. But when I start talking, there's going to be a point where we pass out a flow chart. And the flow chart is going to identify all of these waste streams, and then we're going to go through it together, and you'll be able to write down notes on that as well. And regulators, if you would like a PDF version of that, I can email that to you afterwards, and it's a really helpful tool during inspections. So when we go over the flow chart, just be prepared to see if you got everything or if I missed anything as well so that we can discuss those waste streams. With that being said, my name's Natasha. I work with Sacramento County's Environmental Management Department. I was hired April of 2016, straight out of college. So I came from Kentucky. I went to Eastern Kentucky University. That is a very specific degree, though. I was trained for this job specifically. I have an environmental health sciences degree, and this is what I was trained to do. So I was ready to go straight out of the gate. But with that being said, hopefully you'll enjoy that, and I'll turn it over to Jonathan. We'll get started.
Thank you, Natasha. How y'all doing this afternoon? First, I want to thank you all for being here. I know y'all have other sessions you could be in attendance to. So as a biochemist and someone who's, I would like to say, working on my dissertation in cannabis now, I'm grateful for any opportunity to share my experiences, especially in a subject when it comes to waste management. With that said, I've been working as a chief science officer for a cannabis extraction company in Sacramento for 1.5 years now. And while I'm a transplant who's relatively learning on my feet in real time, a lot of the fundamental things when it comes to extraction in this industry is really no different than anything that's happened behind a bench top for hundreds, if not potentially thousands of years. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes really just going through, in layman's terms, the intricacies of cannabis extraction from having the plant all the way into a finished form. So I'm sure you're already familiar with understanding that cannabis oil extraction is really the method of separating the phytocannabinoids, specifically tetrahydrocannabinol, which is THC, probably the most popular one, and that's also in contingent with CBD, which is the most abundant cannabinoid found in cannabis. As a biochemist who's really interested in the medicinal value of these plant components, in addition to esters, flavonoids, and other things that are found in this plant, I really like understanding how these formulations and compounds can help people and how we can actually utilize them in a resourceful way. However, if you take a step away from the science, there's still some very fascinating things that happens because a lot of these extractors, including myself, there is also a lot of artistry that blends in this intersection for cannabis extraction. So while you still have the same definition at play here, what people usually interact with are oils that come in a variety of forms that are shown here. Some are very brittle and sharp, like salt or sugar. Some are very waxy, which you can find from other plant materials, and some have different consistencies and forms in between, which is very fascinating considering the diversity that you find on the plant side. Now, what I think is really key to understand when talking about cannabis extraction are what are the key processes that make this plant that a lot of us have had experience with on the environmental side or am I in the lab bench all the way into a final form that's safe for use or consumption from a public standpoint. And really, I think the three processes that we really should focus on are material prep, extraction, and post-processing and finishing. So first, I'm going to start talking about the material prep and what goes into those processes before we actually get to the cannabis oil extraction. So if you don't have any knowledge or experience with plant anatomy, most people smoke the flea male plant or the flower itself. That's what is usually burned or inhaled in a joint, a cigarette, or even an oil form that gives people that psychoactive experience. However, cannabinoids can be found in both the male and female parts of the plants at varying ratios. So material prep, it's essential to know actually what are you working with. Are you touching something that has higher THC or higher CBD levels? And if so, are you specifically targeting those compounds to formulate into a product, whether it's a lotion, eye drops, anything that could help deal with pain, anxiety, etc. If you understand what you're wanting to target at the end, it is essential to know what you're working with at the beginning here. And so understanding the anatomy of the plant is essential. What's also very essential is once you actually get into the lab or the extraction space, how you actually handle and prep that material can make an impact on the quality at the end. So really I'm just showing a simple picture and graph right here that's wanting to give you an idea of as you change the particle size of cannabis from, say, whole flower into something that's finely ground in a more uniform size, we actually show data in multiple experiments that suggest that the efficacy of THC extraction and other cannabinoids increases as you reduce the particle size in a more uniform manner. And so you can imagine if you're wanting to produce products at scale, such as like a Colgate-Palmolive or a Procter & Gamble, it's essential to be able that your processes are consistent from batch to batch. So therefore, controlling for particle size and including things such as storage for temperature and climate, these are all things that are very important only at the material, just at the material prep stage alone. Now, this is where I think a lot of the fun stuff comes in because you have a lot of chemistry that takes place from the plant material going into the actual extraction process till when we finally get to the finished product. And if you've been into facilities for extractions before, you've most likely come across one of these three solvents. Hydrocarbons such as butane, hexane, and etc., ethanol, or CO2. And the reason why these three different classes of solvents are used is because depending on the end product, the chemistry that takes place between the cannabis plant material itself and these solvents will lead to different profiles of oil extracts. For example, hydrocarbons are very hydrophobic. Therefore, if you process cannabis with hydrocarbons such as butane, you're most likely to leave water-soluble components in the plant material after extraction. So that's just one tip to keep in mind as we get later to Natasha's section. Whereas with ethanol, which is the solvent of choice in our extraction lab, it's a polar molecule. So I love that we're able to extract and control for both the cannabinoids and the water-soluble components of the plant that could be used further down, either in cannabis products or non-cannabis products. And then last but not least, we also have CO2, which is a very popular gas, as we know, that is very safe to work with in closed-loop systems. However, that doesn't mean if you have a closed-loop system for hydrocarbon, it's also very safe. It's just the chemistry that's really different due to the specifications for getting your finished product. However, once you do your actual extraction, you have usually these really expensive looking machines that more or less look the same regardless of the solvent that you're using. It's really the specifications such as pressure, temperature, etc., that really mitigate getting the differences in qualities and types of oils that we're showing here on this graph. And while this is more of a cartoonish, this is really what I'm really trying to drive here is your solvent of choice and your approach really can make a difference between having a higher THC concentration that's closer to a distillate that could be 80 to 90+% in cannabinoids versus having something that's more of a whole spectrum crude that has fats, waxes, and other plant components that could be used further on. And then last but not least, I think one of the most important key processes after the actual extraction is post-processing with filtration, followed by solvent recovery. And I'm not showing anything about right here that's actually talking about filtration, but there's a variety of different filter aid medias that people could use, such as there's literally sand, you can use silicates, you can use activated carbon, the list goes on, and if you understand how these different types of filter aids are used in your processes, that can make the difference between having a low to a high quality product with the composition you're desired to go for. And once the filtering and processing of the cannabis oil is done, then you're actually left at the final stage, which is the solvent recovery. In our case, we use ethanol, and on small scale, we use a rotary evaporator because it's very easy, you can move it around, and you can handle small loads in a relatively quick amount of time. However, as you can imagine, if you're wanting to scale to be a larger company, being able to recover ethanol at such rates is not going to be sufficient to keep up with competition. So there's also other more arduous processes such as falling film, steam distillation, et cetera, that can also be used for recycling your solvent, in our case ethanol, so that we can reproof it to be reused again in a future extraction. And to me, I think it's just a really beautiful story that can be told when it comes to cannabis extraction, because it really can be full circle depending on your process, if you're understanding from the beginning what you're wanting to get out of the plant all the way to the end and how you reuse your resources accordingly. And on that, I'll turn it over to Natasha.
All right, so he talked a little bit about science. So we went through extraction. We kind of know how that works now. Now we're going to talk about the wastes from extraction. So first, we got to talk about identifying wastes. So for you industry folk, identifying wastes can be multiple things. So I've provided some code sections here for you that we use in California to identify wastes, and then more specifically to identify a hazardous waste. So waste can be anything that it's a byproduct. It can be something that is generated through your processes that you don't need, or it can be something that's used up in your processes that would generate just like maybe like a filter waste or something. We're going to talk about filters a lot later on. And then you need to decide, is that hazardous or not? And then you have to make your waste determination. So if you're making your waste determination to see if it's hazardous or not, here's the code section that you're going to use for that, and that's all of this is going to be in Title 22. So the 4 basic methods that we use to identify hazardous waste in California, they're either listed federally or for California, they're listed for California wastes. And then you can use some generator knowledge, which I'll talk about generator knowledge here in a second. So you can use your SDSs. However, that's going to be a little difficult for this industry because a lot of this industry is using like organic products and nutrients and additives, or they have biodegradable products that the facilities, like Veg Bloom for instance, they might not have any SDSs made at all yet. So this is a huge oversight in this industry. We don't have a lot of SDSs with a lot of information that we can use to make waste determinations. So then we need to go to hazardous waste characteristics. So the 4 that we regulate in California are going to be corrosive, toxic, reactive, and ignitable. And then if you cannot make your waste determination based off of those criteria, then you'll have to go to testing analysis, which has to be done by a third-party certification. I'll talk more about testing later and those specific code sections for each criteria. So generator knowledge, we talked a little bit about that. That is something that is very key for this industry because a lot of the regulators don't have experience. However, we have a lot of different industry. We have people like Jonathan with a chemistry background who come at this knowing the chemistry that's happening. And then you have people that learn from the YouTube videos. Show of hand, who's watched YouTube videos on extraction? A few of you? Does anybody notice that they don't actually talk about what's happening in those videos, right? They're just showing you how to plug it in, which valves to touch, which ones to use. So any Joe Blow off the street can learn how to do extraction through these YouTube videos, but they're not actually learning it. That doesn't mean that you can't. You can get the chemistry books, you can learn it all, but there's a lot of chemistry happening and a lot of people aren't realizing that. They're thinking you can just learn all of this off of YouTube, it's completely safe. It's really not. You need to understand what's happening. And if you understand what's happening chemically, you are then able to make your waste determinations. So winterization. Another thing with this industry, not having that chemistry background, is you'll notice they use the terms interchangeably a lot through extraction. They'll use winterization to cover everything from actually winterization to distillation. So, and that's how you can tell your difference if you've got a real chemist or if you've got somebody that's just been doing this for 10 years and really thinks that they know what they're doing, because then they're just going to call everything winterization. Winterization is literally just this definition right here. It's the fractional crystallization of oils by controlled cooling or heating to remove higher melting point glycerides and thus prevent or retard cloudiness during subsequent storage at chill temperatures. So how they're doing this is for Jonathan's facility, for instance, and most facilities, they're going to add ethanol to their extract, and then they're going to freeze it. We're going to stick it in a freezer for 24 to 48 hours. If you're doing hydrocarbon, this actually can be part of your closed loop system and can happen at the same time as everything else and can go a lot faster because hydrocarbons are a little bit more efficient for extraction. However, in Sacramento, we don't allow hydrocarbons at this time. So we only see CO2 and ethanol. So if we get hydrocarbon questions, somebody in the audience might have to help me with those because we don't see those. Okay, so here's some examples of the winterization. So this is the CAPNA freezer. So inside, generally they have like 4 little units where they can put the ethanol and the extract and let that happen. And then there's an example of some in-process ethanols being recovered and being chilled during the winterization process. That was actually found at a legal facility that was all embargoed. So then filtration. So filtration is completely separate from winterization, but again, they combine these terms a lot. So it's really helpful for you, like when you take my flow chart, if you decide to create your own flow chart if you don't like mine. But I think it's really helpful when you're going through extraction with the chemist, because he can tell you what's going on, but you can notice if he knows actually what's going on, or if they just are using terms interchangeably. So, and they're all split out on the flow chart that I'll provide you later. So the filtration, they're actually removing those lipids and waxes from winterization that were separated. So that fractional crystallization occurred, and now we've got to separate it out. So they're going to remove the lipid wax residue. They can do this with filters. They can do this with filter cake media. We'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm actually going to switch mics. And then note the resulting. Okay. The resulting product after filtration does still contain all of that ethanol and the activated carbon. So does anybody know what they use the activated carbon for? No? So they're actually cleaning it up a little bit. It helps pull out the chlorophyll so that they can get a cleaner looking product. Now this activated carbon does get pulled out later on in the process, so keep that in mind. So here's some examples of filtration. So typically we see the vacuum filtration on site, and then we've got some sand keeping that in place. Keep the sand in mind as well, what's happening with the sand. So they've got a filter in there. You can kind of see that middle picture right there. The filter is right at the bottom. And then over on the left is the filter sludge waste from one of my facilities. And note that does still contain ethanol. We opened up that bucket and the ethanol just hits you right in the face. Not labeled, not anything. So waste determination, again. And then over on the right is just an example of what it actually looks like, what's happening in the filtration. You're getting that product at the bottom that you really want. Typically, we don't see the clear containers like that, but I just wanted to show you that's actually what's happening is coming out as the product at the bottom. All right, and after filtering, we go to distillation. So they're going to purify up their oils to get what they actually want. So this is really all about the terpenes. So terpenes for the cannabis industry are going to provide that odor and the flavor that they really want for their specific strain or whatever they want to put it in. But for us, it means that they're using volatiles in their process. And this is actually using the terpenes, putting them back into the process, adding and mixing them, has to be permitted by the fire marshal, and that needs to be done under closed hoods and vents. So if you see anything happening with the terpenes, just keep in mind that they are volatile. So we've got some examples of some distillations here. The one on the left did not get used. Wrong button. This facility was closed down, but this one right here is a pretty good one. The sesquiterpenes come off right here. The product comes out over here, and this would be any recovered ethanol that they can use. And all of that is happening right here in this heated condenser. Okay. So we talked about solvent recovery a lot. That means we're talking about some recycling and some reclamation, right? So there are a lot of code sections that come into play with that. So I'm not going to give you the answers. As industry, we can't give you the answers. You have to know what you're doing. And your process has to fit within this regulation, and you have to be able to demonstrate that to us. And if you can't, then you can't recycle. Okay, because you are recycling hazardous materials. So does your process fit? Is it A, B, C, or D? That is the code section. But you have to figure it out, and you have to be able to tell which one it is. But you also have to keep in mind speculative accumulation. So speculative accumulation, that's the code section for the definition there, but it basically means any amount of recyclable material that you accumulate within the calendar year, you have to prove that 75% of that has been recycled by the end of that calendar year. And if you haven't, then all of it has to go to waste. So you can't just recycle and reuse and repurpose your ethanol. You actually need to have a documentation log, and you need to keep track of this because your regulator is going to ask you. They're not just going to let you keep a bunch of ethanol sitting around. Think your fire people are going to have a lot more problem with that than we would, though. So again, what's important? Generator knowledge. So it's really important for these facilities to know what they're talking about, and you as the regulator, they have no idea. This is new to them. They have a willingness to comply. They want to comply. They want this to be legal. They don't want to be in the closet anymore, but they don't know what they're doing yet. So you need to help them with the regulations, but you need to let them do it on their own. You can't do it for them. So generator knowledge is incredibly important here for waste determinations. Okay, so Jordan is going to pass out a flow chart, so we'll pause while he's passing that out to everybody. But we're going to watch this little video right here, and this is just some solvent recovery happening at one of our facilities that I recorded, so you can just actually see that happening. There's no sound. So you can just see the ethanol coming back out there, and it's being collected in that bottom apparatus. That's all there is to it. That's how they recover their ethanol. Okay, I'm going to wait a few minutes, make sure everybody gets their flow chart. I don't want to move on without you. Anybody think they know all the waste streams yet? No? Okay, so your flow charts are stapled backwards, so we're going to start with the second sheet, not the first one. Apologies on that. So we're going to start with actual extraction. So again, I don't have hydrocarbons on here because we don't see hydrocarbons in Sacramento at this time. Ken, do you know when is that coming? Soon. It's coming soon. But it will fit within this flow chart if you are using hydrocarbons. There's not too many differences, but we'll talk about those after the flow charts. Okay, so these flow charts you can use if you have comments that you want to give me, if I'm missing something, if you want to add to it. Please reach out. I don't think that I have all the answers. This is just where I'm at right now. All right, so we start up here with our ground flour. I have really shaky hands. Ground flour. So we either go CO2 or the ethanol up at the top. You guys can follow along on yours. I'm not going to try to use that. All right, so we go from the ground flour, and if you are doing the CO2 or the hydrocarbon, you're recovering all of that solvent, and then it's going to slightly off-gas if you're underneath all of your hoods and everything. We don't have any concerns with that cannabis waste at this time. That ground flour can be composted. And then, so that solvent recovery happens if you're doing the ethanol, and the solvent recovery happens on that ground flour. If they're able to actually recover all of the ethanol, then the ground flour can still be composted. I haven't seen that happen yet, and I don't even know how we would test to see if all of the ethanol was recovered. So we'll have to do some testing to see how that actually works. I don't have any facilities that have that actually going yet. So in my opinion, it's probably a hazardous waste, but we'll have to see how much ethanol is able to be pulled out of that ground flour. And with that, so you've got that ethanol, the solvent recovery. So then we've got to think, okay, we've got hazardous waste, they're toxics. All of our toxics get sent to Utah in California. So how do we get them there? So after the ground flour, we're done with that. We're going to follow that middle black line. And that is just going to be the same no matter what process you're doing. Because no matter what process you're doing, you're always going to use ethanol. Because winterization always happens with ethanol. So there's no solventless, there's no CO2 extraction, no solvents used. They're always using ethanol. So they're going to take their crude extract after they've done their first or second run. CO2, sometimes they do 2 runs because they like to pull off those extra terpenes, and then they can add them back into the process after distillation. But that depends on the facility. And then they're going to add that ethanol for the winterization. And when they're adding that ethanol, they're also adding that activated carbon to clean it up. So that activated carbon sits in there with the ethanol and doesn't come out until post-solvent recovery. So that activated carbon, some facilities are claiming that they can reactivate and use that on site. I have yet to see that happen. So that's a waste determination that we're going to need to talk about. Is the activated carbon actually going to be able to be recycled and reused? I haven't seen that work yet. They're claiming they can. Haven't seen it yet. And then after the activated carbon, they do the filtration. We've done all of our solvent recovery. So I've got some code sections provided in here for you. So this orange box with the lipids, so that code section right there is for repurposing. So basically, you've reclaimed all of your ethanol. You've got this, basically a paraffin wax. You've got this paraffin wax that can be used by some other facilities for things. But you've got to prove that it can be used. And it can't be sham recycling, so beware of all of your sham recyclings and your tars. No toxics along for the ride, so you got to be able to pull out all of your solvents before that can be repurposed. And some people want to make candles or soaps. Cosmetic industry can use this to make soaps. And some facilities have even shown interest for surfboard waxes. So there's a possibility for a waste stream to be deemed not a waste. But again, you got to go through that code section and know how you can fall out from treatment. And then that's your reclamation code there for the solvent recovery. So after we've reclaimed all of our ethanol and we've got our decarb has happening, and that's just removing of the carboxylic acid, sorry, and that just evaporates away. Okay, so then we go to distillation. So they're gonna do the distillation a couple times because they're purifying that up. This is just them getting the product that they want. So they're gonna pull out all of those terpenes, they're gonna add in the applicable terpenes to get their final product. Now we've got to talk about the waste. So some of the sesquiterpenes that they pull out, and sesquiterpenes, there's like 4 or 5 strands of terpenes that some facilities just can't identify what the specific aromas or flavors would be, so they don't want to use that in their product. Jonathan's facility, they're called TOTALEAF. They use every bit of everything that they can in their product. Anything that's pulled out, they try to throw right back in. They're a minimal waste facility. So that's great, but then that means Jonathan's got to jump through all of the recycling and reuse hoops. Yep. So the sesquiterpenes, those are going to be possibly volatile again, so waste determination needed there. And then you've got that paraffin wax waste at the bottom. There's some residue that comes out after distillation that they just can't use. So if that is, again, able to be used for cosmetic purposes or for surfboards or candles, they just need to be able to legitimize that. No sham recycling. Got to be able to legitimize it. And you've got to be able to legitimize it within these code sections. So if you're industry, you did get a flow chart. Is there any industry in here? Are we all regulators? I think we're all regulators. Okay, you all get the flow chart, and if you want a PDF, just email me. I will send you a PDF. Any questions on the flow chart so far?
What kind of toxics along the ride are you seeing at that lipids phase that's coming out here that is a waste/byproduct?
Well, we can't really test for toxics at the moment, right? For cannabis. Are we all familiar with the issue with the aquatic toxicity test and what we're seeing in the cannabis waste streams? We're not. Okay, I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So can I put a pin in your question? Yeah? Okay, he had a question about toxics along for the ride, if anyone didn't hear that, but we'll come back to it. Okay, so the differences in the methods of extraction and waste, this is just kind of simplified for you here a little bit. All of the waste streams are going to be mostly the same. So we've got the filter media. That'll also include that sand. So that sand is kind of cleaning out their oil a little bit as well. It's kind of working like a backwash. Anybody regulate wells or water facilities? The sand filter backwash, it's kind of working the exact same way. So they've got to make a waste determination on that sand. Then you've got your sludge wax waste. Again, that solvent is going to be recovered. We've got to make sure we're staying within that recovery time, within those regulations for recovering your solvent. And then you've got to make your waste determination on your sludge and your wax waste. There has been, I'll talk about that later. And then your terpenes, so you got your terpenes, and then any ethanol that is left over. I know facilities repurpose this, use it as much as they can, but I think 2 times is about as much as they can use the ethanol before it starts to lose its efficacy. So then they'll reuse it for cleaning because the resin is very sticky off of this. So their entire facility is going to be covered in resin. So it's a great cleaning solvent that they can use. Again, got to do that within those recycling regulations. And then all except for the cannabis shake for the hydrocarbons and the carbon dioxide because that'll off-gas underneath your vents. And we don't really have hazardous concerns other than that aquatic toxicity at this time. Okay, so waste determinations. So the carbon dioxide, I just talked about that. It can be compostable because it's going to do that little bit of off-gassing. However, the ethanol extraction is compostable at this time if they can prove that solvent recovery happens. However, per DTSC at this time, cannabis has not been said that it's non-hazardous, but it hasn't been right out said as hazardous either. So for Sacramento, we are not actually at this time seeking to say cannabis plant waste is hazardous, but the test that we use is the aquatic toxicity test. And there was Assembly Bill 733 that was just brought up on February 19th, and that was to add for DTSC to come up with alternative test methods other than the aquatic toxicity to avoid killing of the fish. So we'll see what happens with that. Keep that in mind for upcoming. Yeah. There is, yeah, through the waste concurrence process, yes. And so the CUPA Forum Board is working on that. If you are coming to the Has Waste Tag tomorrow, I believe we're going to get an update from Nick Crane, and then we're also going to talk about cannabis processing wastes tomorrow and for cultivations. So we're just talking about extraction, but at the Has Waste Tag tomorrow, we'll talk about cultivations. And then so that lipid residue, that post-ethanol reclamation, if they can't find a way to recycle that, they need to make a proper waste determination. That needs to go either to solid waste, hazardous waste, what's still left in there. How are we going to make the waste determinations without using aquatic toxicity? Does anybody have any ideas on how they've done that? I have an idea, but I want to see if anybody else has come up with anything. No? Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute. So, and then the paraffin wax, if they can't sell that, honestly, I urge the facilities to try to find somebody to buy that and reuse it, because it's an unnecessary waste in my opinion, but it is going to be a flammable waste. All right, so the testing requirements. So toxicity is our biggest concern with this industry. We do have the flammability concerns, but I think for the most part we know what's flammable and what's not flammable. However, the toxicity. So DTSC, we're still waiting to see what's going to come down the pipeline there, so we're holding off. So what I've kind of done, and this is not a proven method, I am not recommending anyone do this, but I am looking at the SDSs for the actual solvents used at my facilities. I'm going through the toxicity data provided on those SDS sheets, and I'm looking at those solvent levels, and I'm seeing if their residual solvent testing on the sledges at the end are below those toxicity levels listed on the SDSs for the products they use. And if the waste contains below that amount, then I'm kind of erring on the side, it's probably going to be non-hazardous in our eyes. However, we still need that aquatic toxicity because that's code. We can't really circumvent code, so we've got to wait for that. So cleaning. I just said resin everywhere. This place is very, very sticky. They clean, but they clean everything with ethanol. So you're going to go right back to that solvent recovery slide, and you're going to see in that process for cleaning how you recover your solvent, when is it a waste, when can you recycle it, and when you cannot. So cleaning in place, all of your equipment they're going to use the ethanol to clean that. And I talk really fast, so I hope you guys have lots of questions. Yeah. It's for everything. There have been multiple streams tested. We have done outdoor leaves, indoor leaves, waxes. They've done the oils. Everything fails the fish bioassay. The 96-hour, within 24 hours, 100% of the fish die. However, it's due to BOD concerns, which is the biological oxygen demand, not necessarily what we want from that test. Exactly. Eucalyptus trees will do the same thing. So will milk. So milk has that exemption from DTSC to not be considered hazardous. However, DTSC is cautiously not making that decision yet because there was a facility in the southern region, I'm not really sure where, but they were an edible manufacturer, and they cleaned off all of their equipment on the outside, and it went into a stream, and all of the fish in the stream died. So it could have been the cleaning product, it could have been what they were infusing their edibles with, we really don't know. Correct. Correct. Technically it could, but for the most part, that closed loop system, it's pretty effective, and I think UL is right on the borderline of coming out with a closed loop system for butane. It recovers. Is it considered what? I'm sorry? Which part? Correct. Which they could, correct, but most of the facilities want to recover the ethanol because the ethanol that they're using is that food grade ethanol. It can be quite expensive depending on where they're getting it from. So that is considered treatment. However, if they can prove through these regulations here how they're reclaiming it, then it falls out of treatment. It's not exempt from treatment, it just falls out of treatment.
All right, so my one question is, in the regulations state that the biomass is considered solid waste. Now, with the way you're saying it, I know testing it, it's going to kill the fish. We already knew that. Mm-hmm. How's that going to affect how they're disposing of it? Because right now we have two methods of disposal up in our county. We have solid waste; they can send it off as solid waste in the dumpster. Mm-hmm. Or we have a company up in Monterey called Gaica, who's actually does that. Yeah. So, I mean, how's this going to affect that? Because that's a question we've been trying to
It's a
around.
huge question, and in Sacramento we're facing it quite a bit. Waste is it is the issue, especially when we start talking about the vape pens as well. Like we're not really. So Cal Recycle and DTSC and all of the state agencies, they're still discussing this. And we're still waiting for those answers to come down the pipeline. So, I mean, it's hard to speculate on what they're going to say at this point, but they're still talking. So it's a lot of the upper level talking right now, and we just kind of have to wait and see. But yes, we do need more waste avenues. Yeah.
It's not so much related to hazardous waste, but when you say you're, hello?
There you go.
Okay. It's not so much related to the hazardous waste, but when you say you're recycling the ethanol as a cleaning product, how extensive are you using that in the processing area?
I will let Jonathan answer that one.
So to answer your question, I usually triple distill my ethanol before I actually reuse it in actual extraction. And then when it transfers from being an extraction solvent to then a cleaning solution, I still triple distill it, and then I dilute it into a 70% ethanol solution with deionized water. And so I make sure to do that so that we're not adding any heavy metals and other particulates that could be found in hard water to contaminate our food, our food grade tabletops, the glassware, et cetera. It gets everywhere.
Oh,
Everywhere.
it
can get everywhere if you don't handle things properly.
I'm just saying that as a fire inspector, I might come in there and I question you for using that. I don't know if anybody has in the past as a cleaning agent inside the building.
It hasn't been an issue for us, but it's a very common practice outside of the cannabis industry too, when it comes to using ethanol for a cleaning solution in certain labs.
Ken, do you want to add anything? He's on my firefighter guy right there. Just find him. Any other questions?
Does it get into use constituting disposal at all because you buy supplemental cleaning fluids, or do you satisfy your own cleaning fluid needs and then use them, maybe overuse them so that you don't have to pay for that disposal?
That's a good question. So we do use a lot of ethanol. Just to, I guess, make that clear. To give you an idea, our goal is if we're doing enough production runs in one day, we expect to recycle up to 35 to 55 gallons minimum. But you can imagine if you're using that only twice, we can generate quickly a lot of ethanol to go into the cleaning supply room. But if you're talking about a 10,000 square foot lab with plenty of glassware, 30-foot high ceilings, you can also use a lot of ethanol for cleaning.
And to further go on the use constituting disposal, if the cannabis waste would come back as hazardous, we would have an issue with the plant waste as it's being composted. Right. So it's just still more questions that need to be answered by the powers that be.
Yeah, I always recommend with my peers who are using ethanol as an extraction method is to centrifuge their plant material after extraction. And if they do that with certain specs, you actually can recover up to 96 or so %, looking at the studies I've used with this equipment, of ethanol from the plant material itself.
So I kind of have two questions. Jonathan, has nothing to do with waste extraction, I guess, but I want to know if the marijuana is a plant that has a lot of things that you can do with it. Is that unique for this particular plant, or is there other plants that do that?
I do think there are unique qualities to cannabis. I don't want to say its resourcefulness or its usefulness as a whole plant is unique to cannabis as a whole, but since Prohibition has enabled us to be able to do research extensively for all these years or decades, we are now just scratching the surface of how not only the cannabinoids, but all the other parts of the plant, including the fats, the waxes. I'm really interested in the flavonoids and the esters and how they can be used, whether for medicinal purposes, wellness purposes, and as we're exploring, even recreational purposes too. And so I'm still a student of this. I don't want to speak like I've been doing it for too long, but just from scratching at the surface, being in a lab now and getting my feet wet, it's phenomenal of how much you can use this plant for.
And that seems to be unique just to the cannabis plant, not to lots of other different plants, or don't have the experience necessarily with those other kinds of plants?
Well, it's not that I don't have the experience. I've worked with a variety of different botanicals, to say the least, but in the context of that intersection of medicine and health and also recreational, I literally in our building we talk about, do we want to make soaps? Do we want to make bath bombs? Do we want to make gum? Do we want to make wine? Literally, you can walk into a Target and almost anything on the shelf can now be a cannabis product.
Okay. All right, thanks. My other question is, we have a couple of solid waste facilities that have called our DA's office and asked if it's okay to deposit I think what they're asking is once the buds or whatever has been harvested, they have this leftover.
It's the biomass.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They want to know if they can take that to the landfills, and our question, well, we don't exactly know.
The
'cause
answer is yes.
Okay, that's good to know.
The answer is yes. However, they have to meet all of those qualifications through the composting rules, which are it has to be composted on site if they're composting, or it needs to be made unrecognizable and mixed with 50% inert material. And then as long as they meet that with all the holding times and they get their receipt from the landfill, there is no issue with them self-disposing to a landfill.
So we need to refer them to the recycling section.
The
composting section.
I think it starts with 50-55 in CCR.
Okay.
I think it's 50-55 that starts with the compostings.
Thanks.
You're welcome. Anybody else? Comments? Did I miss anything? No? All right. Well, I'm sorry for being so quick, but I guess you can go have a beer early now, right? Yeah. Thank you, guys.